People will often say, isn't it arrogant to believe that Jesus is the only way? And honestly, that's a good question. And truly, sometimes those of us who hold the position that Jesus is the only way are arrogant about it. But I would say that at the core, if we really understand who Jesus is and what he held to, it's not an arrogant position. And to explain it, let me draw an analogy. Let me just ask you to consider Martin Luther King Jr. and someone who today might say, I'm a follower of Martin Luther King Jr. So picture, if you will, that person saying that to you. And then they follow that up with, but I don't really believe in racial equality or civil rights. What would you say? What would you think? Now, your answers might range from, well, that person's a little misguided, all the way to, oh, that person's an idiot. And they're clearly ignorant. Because Martin Luther King Jr. talked about racial equality and civil rights. You can make a good case that a lot of his life was devoted to racial equality and civil rights, and he did die because of his belief and conviction that racial equality was important. Civil rights were as well. Now, what does that have to do with the question about Jesus being the only way? Well, sticking with the person who says they're a follower of Martin Luther King Jr., it wouldn't be reasonable for them to call themselves a follower without holding to what he talked about, what he lived for, and what he died for. Just wouldn't make sense. The only appropriate position for someone who is a follower of Martin Luther King Jr. would be to believe in racial equality and civil rights. Now let me take the analogy over to Jesus being the only way. Jesus talked about being the only way in the Bible. One of the clearest places in John 14. Around verse 6, he says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. You know, I've looked at that verse. I've looked at the context, the surrounding verses. It's pretty clear contextually that he is saying he is the only way for people to get to the Father, for them to be in right standing with God. He also lived that out throughout his life. Let me just briefly share an example. When he was in the garden towards the end of his life, he prayed to the Father, and he said, Father, if possible, take this cup from me. Not my will, but yours be done. In essence, what he was saying is, if there's some other way for mankind to be right with you, God, let's go with that way. But if this is the only way, I'm willing to do it. And shortly after that time, he went to the cross willingly. And that's the third point. He went to the cross willingly. He died for the conviction that he was the only way. So Jesus talked about being the only way. He lived for that, and he died for that. In his case, willingly. So as I step back from that, I think, well, how can I take any other position as a follower of him than that he's the only way? It's the only reasonable position, on par with the only reasonable position for someone who's a follower of Martin Luther King Jr. to believe in racial equality and civil rights. Now let me just share one more thought on this. Just because I feel that it's reasonable to believe that Jesus is the only way, and others like me as well, that doesn't excuse the mistake we've made a lot of the time in thinking that makes us better than other people, smarter, more devout. It doesn't necessarily. There's a lot of smart people, nice people, devout people who believe other things. But at the end of the day, I look at the belief that Jesus is the only way as not something that's necessarily an arrogant position, but really the only reasonable position for someone who comes to understand who Jesus talked about being, lived out, and what he died for.